Thanks. Oh, that's much better. So mythology retellings, there's been several of the Trojan War. And so when we set out to write this story, we wanted to make sure we were offering something fresh and unique and that hadn't been done before. So there's kind of a few reasons why we took the approach that we did. So the first is that we wanted to write, I should stop and mention when I keep saying we. This AD Rhine is a pseudonym. So my name is Ashlee Cowles. I am the A in AD Rhine, and the D is my childhood best friend of over 25 years, Danielle Stinson, who couldn't be here tonight because she lives outside of Washington, D.C. But we wrote both of these novels together thanks to the miracle that is Google Docs, and we were able to craft this story together. We've been friends since we met on a U.S. military base in Germany when we were 15. And I think we grew up with a love of war stories and grew up in a military culture and really intimately understood what it was like to be inside this little community that maybe the rest of the world doesn't really have an inside look at, and to watch loved ones go off to war, to wonder what's going to happen, wonder if you can do anything about it. And so that was definitely part of the reason we wanted to tell the story in the way that we did. It was very much rooted in our own experiences to show the women and the children behind the walls of Troy what was their experiences like, because we know what was happening on the battlefield in many other versions. We know, what's going on with Achilles and Patroclus, but what was going on the Trojan side with those non-combatants behind the walls. And also, could they make a difference? Did they have agency, even though they, were part of a war they didn't choose, they didn't ask for, and that they were just trying to survive, but could they still have agency in some way, even, given their situation? So that was definitely one of the reasons we wrote the story the way we did, is we wanted to bring our own personal experiences growing up, watching loved ones serve in the military and knowing what it's like to be that dependent who's witnessing it but not necessarily part of it. The other aspect we were really interested in was telling a historically rooted retelling of the Trojan War. So Danielle and I both love mythology, but we never, when we read the Iliad, we both have our experiences with Homer's original Iliad and Odyssey, the epics that really form, so much the basis of literature in the West, essentially, and just so many of our stories and myths and legends call back to the Iliad and the Odyssey in some way. And we wanted to, we love the stories of the gods and the goddesses, but we were always most drawn to the people. We were most drawn to the people who maybe only got a few lines in the original epics, but seemed like they had a depth of character and seemed like there was maybe more going on behind the scenes than how it originally appeared. And so that was something we wanted to explore, and we really wanted to try to root the story in history, because Bronze Age history is really fascinating. We don't know too much about it, well, at least until recently, because it's archaeology. So it's the more we learn about, the more archaeological discoveries that are made, the more we're learning about this period, since it's pre-written history. And so we really wanted to ask, if the Trojan War actually happened, how would it have been fought? Were the Trojans dumb enough to bring in a giant wooden horse and pull that into their city at the end of the war? Or could that be a Greek is telling the story, and so perhaps their enemy is defeated through this very gullible move? And so we wanted to ask ourselves, what would have been the Trojan horse that ended up being the downfall of Troy? If the gods and goddesses weren't moving the players around like chess pieces, could there perhaps be people, shadows, women, children behind the scenes who were influencing things that ended up affecting the outcome of the war? And so, of course, we have, the Greek pantheon, we have the Anatolians, the Trojans, the gods and goddesses they would have believed in, but we were less interested in making those the characters and more interested in really focusing on the people and connecting the myth to a war that most historians and archaeologists think actually happened. So the idea is that if this war has lived on in our imaginations for thousands of years, and people in the ancient past believed it was because the war actually happened. And there's actually been archaeological discoveries of a site that they believe was ancient Troy. And the fall of the city really was related to the fall of all of civilization at that time. So there was climate change, there was mass migration, there was all these things that feel kind of eerily relevant to some of the challenges we're facing in our very interconnected world, because that time, the Bronze Age, was also very connected geopolitically. And so we were interested in kind of bringing all of that to life, looking at the Anatolian cultures, not just the Greek side of the story, but saying, okay, the Trojans, we've only seen their story through the lens of the Greek poet Homer, and he basically makes them identical to the Greeks. They have the same gods and goddesses, they wear the same clothes, they eat the same foods, they talk in the same way in the original epics, but they most likely would have been people who had their own unique culture, and so that was something we were interested in exploring, the cultures of Anatolia, modern day Turkey, which is where Troy would have been placed. And so those were kind of our three reasons for telling the story the way we did, our own upbringing, and wanting to bring that perspective growing up in a community and a military community, witnessing kind of the warrior ethos firsthand, wanting to tell a historically rooted version of this story, and then also really wanting to shine a light on the unknown, the cultures that have not been really highlighted in different retellings of this story. So now I'll get into the characters, because that's the other reason we told it from the perspective of women. And honestly, like, that just happened kind of naturally. It wasn't necessarily the motivation. Honestly, Danielle and I would both say we're huge Hector fangirls. Like, that growing up, we always were drawn to the story of Hector, and that's probably because he reminded us of our dads. So he's the noble warrior who's defending his city he doesn't want to go fight. He's trying to defend his city from people who are invading his land. And he just always stood out as this noble, heroic character. And interestingly, all the women we have in our book, in the original Iliad, he interacts with all of them. So they're not given very many lines in Homer's epic, but when they do speak, they're almost always speaking to Hector. And we thought that was really interesting to say, and we didn't plan this, but kind of looking back, we're like, oh, we wanted to tell the story of Hector. How interesting that we ended up telling it through 4 women. And we wanted to give them their own voice as well, of course, but it was interesting that we thought the best way to tell the story from Hector's perspective was to tell it through these women that he actually acknowledged in the original epic, when not many other characters really gave them the time of day. So first we have Andromache, who is Hector's headstrong wife. In the original, she is the mother of the city's heir, and she is a loyal wife to Hector. There's a few scenes in the original story where you kind of see their bond. The famous farewell scene in book 6 of the Iliad is any military spouse or child will recognize that, will read that scene and feel like it's something from a picture out of their own lives. It's her saying goodbye to her husband she has this newborn baby, and her husband's about to go off to fight a battle that she thinks he's not going to return from. And so in the original, that's Andromache. She's the loyal wife and the mother of the heir. But there's some really interesting lines in the Iliad where it says that Hector listens to his wife's counsel. And we always thought that was very interesting, because we're like, well, what is she giving him advice about? He's the commander of Troy's army. Like, wonder what insight she's giving. And so that's why we decided to take a slightly different angle with Andromache's character and give her a whole backstory where she is actually trained by Amazons. And she is a daughter of Anatolia, so she is not Greek. She's from the eastern plains of Anatolia, and she is raised by, she's the youngest daughter with 10 older brothers and raised by a king who sends her off to the Amazons to learn how to be a warrior. And, you know, what was really fun digging into the research is we learned Amazons are not just myths. There's actually been archaeological discoveries recently all along the Black Sea and kind of the Eurasian steppe, where we've uncovered warrior women graves, graves that people just assumed were male, and because they were buried with weapons, until DNA testing, recent DNA testing has been able to reveal, like, oh, these are actually women. So the idea that there were women warriors is not, you know, some kind of modern day fabrication of the past or just a myth, you know, with the idea of the Amazons, but it's probably, or it is something that existed. So her character was really fun to kind of take, you know, the original version, loyal wife and mother, and then say, well, what if she's this warrior and she's in a city that won't allow her to fight because she is the heir's mother, and she you know, is watching all the men she loves go off, and she feels this pull to be useful, to contribute in that way, but the culture of Troy does not permit that. So that's a bit of her tension. Then we have Helen of Troy, or Helen of Sparta, depending on how you want to look at it. And we always think of her as the face, or the name everyone knows and the person nobody actually understands. So we were really interested in giving Helen a more sympathetic portrayal. Even in, I would say, in most modern day retellings, she's not often portrayed positively, which we felt like that's been done. Like, blaming Helen for the war has been kind of the story forever, and we wanted to say, well, what if there was a different reason? What if she didn't necessarily go with Paris willingly? What if Paris was kind of as big of a jerk as he always kind of seemed to me when I read the original story, and maybe he had more to do with why the war started, and it was his own political ambitions that had something to do with why the war started than, you know, a beauty contest among goddesses and Helen running off and leaving her daughter and leaving Sparta to go to Troy. So in our version, Helen is definitely a conflicted woman who's kind of struggling with this idea of guilt because she has been blamed for the war and because the war started in her name, but who longs for her daughter back in Sparta, and whose only solace is really working as a healer. And in the first book, her and Andromache are at odds the entire time, because Andromache sees her the same way everybody else does, as the cause of the war. But in the second book, Daughters of Bronze, they really have to forge an alliance to affect the war, to change the fate of the war, even if it's in a very small way. Then we have Rhea, who is a young horse whisperer turned Trojan servant. She's rescued by Hector in the first book, and so in the second book, she is fully part of Hector and Andromache's household. And she serves as our Trojan spy who is able to leave the city unnoticed, and there's a whole thread where she is in the enemy camps, working to bring back messages to the Trojans. And at first glance, that might seem a little far-fetched, like, wouldn't the Greeks notice there's a strange woman walking around the camps? But the camps of the Achaeans were on the beaches for 10 years. And so these were not just, like, you know, tents. They built basically a city, and women were prizes of war. So every time, you know, they went and raided a village, they brought back women. So there's this whole, the camp of the Greeks is run by women. And so Rhea is able to infiltrate this camp and be a part of it and go unseen as she forms relationships with the women who are being held there as slaves. And so that is how she is able to bring back information to the Trojans and kind of influence what's going on in the Greek camp. And then finally, we have the prophetess Cassandra, who probably, along with Helen, is the other character who's most well known. Oh, I should say about Rhea really quickly. She's often, you know, mentioned as being a completely fictional character, and she is a character in the sense that she's not named in the original story, And we did create her, entirely from our own imaginations, but we based her off of a servant girl who in the original Iliad is in that famous farewell scene is holding Andromache and Hector's son. So we always like to say she is in the original epic, but for us she kind of represents one of those unnamed women, one of those unnamed people who has a whole story, but it's never shown. And so that's what we wanted to do is to show, give her a backstory, give her a voice, and show how she's impacting the war. So again, back to Cassandra. She is a prophetess. She has visions, and she knows Troy's fate. And in the original myth, the story is, she rejects the advances of the god Apollo, and so she is cursed with being able to see the truth, see the future, but no man will ever believe her. And so we liked that. We said, okay, no man will ever believe her. But what if she finds a sisterhood of women who do believe her? And we also wanted to play with the idea, what if it isn't a god who curses Cassandra? What if she has an abuser and she has to confront that trauma as she's trying to kind of work through her visions and figure out if there's some way to stop the destruction of Troy that she's seen. So those are the four POV characters, the four women of Troy who must come together to try to save their city, or at least save some small hope for their city. If you know the story, you know the Trojans don't win. But one of the things we really wanted to do with this duology is try to bring just the smallest spark of hope to this tragic tale. And we really thought we could do that by showing the women's relationships and this one mission they're kind of coming together to rally around. So I thought I would read a chapter from, or a part of a chapter from Cassandra. I'm just gonna grab some water. And I don't want to explain too much or give too much away, but Cassandra basically, she's known throughout Troy as having 5 faces. So 5 kind of representations. Everyone thinks she's crazy. And I won't say too much about what these 5 faces mean or what they represent. We kind of want to leave them open to interpretation, but if you hear me describing different voices or different people that she's interacting with kind of internally, that's what that's about. It's the 5 faces of Cassandra. I stare unblinking at the door of my tower. It stares back. Wooden, heavy, locked from the outside by order of the woman who bore me, by the father who loved me until he came to know me. As if love were a box that could be opened and closed, as if I had any choice in the matter. Strange child, they called me. Back when I was a small girl and the things I saw were mere sketches layered over the world that shone through my eyes. Hellenus couldn't see them. Not until I gripped his hand and showed him. At first, my twin brother was as eager as I to watch the colors dance. But slowly, slowly, he began to pull away, too frightened by the shapes he saw moving in my vision. The shapes never scared me, neither did the light. I would marvel at the pictures it made. I would babble my delight to anyone who would listen, and then I'd watch as their expressions changed, from indulgence to confusion, amusement to discomfort. So too did change the names they called me. Gifted became grotesque. Charming became cursed. Strange became broken. All these things and more the world will never know. Truths interwoven with lies. Lies spun out of truths until they were indistinguishable. Until there was no room left in the tapestry for me. Strange girl, they said. And so I am. So we are, trapped, inside the prison of my head, inside the cage of this room. At least that is what they say. I take a single step toward the door. A sharp pain spears my abdomen, sending ripples down my legs. My breaths are jagged slashes in the silence. I wait for it to pass before I take another step. Roots sprout through my feet straight down to the floor. The hawk cries out. His wings blossom in my chest in answer to the call of the wind. Fly, the wind howls. Fly, fly, fly. Away from this tower, away from the ache in your guts and the door blocking your way and the death bird smiling at you from the corner wearing a skull's face. I look sideways and there it is, lurking, leering at me with a smile that is also a grimace, teeth and bone and gray flesh crawling with maggots. I close my eyes, but still I see it, squatting as it has done every day for 9 cycles of the moon, taunting me with the corners of my cage, taunting me from the corners of my cage before it lights out of the window, climbing the night on black wings, circling my tower 3 times before coming to rest on a single roof in the second innermost circle of the city. My hawk has tried to fight it off, but the raptor always melts into the shadows before he can reach it. The raptor stirs again in the corner of my vision. It has been sitting there for hours, ever since the serpent appeared in the sky. The last piece, the final sign, event set into motion that can no longer be stopped. The only question now, who will strike first? I take another stumbling step forward and the raptor makes its move. It streaks across the floor of my chamber and throws itself into the air. Black robes sprout into feathers as it falls. Landing on that roof, I know well, for I love the people it shelters. People too consumed by the threats outside to see death hanging by taloned feet above their very heads. The death raptor screams as it has every night, but unlike every night before, it does not remain on the roof where I can watch it just as it watches me. Tonight the shadow melts, black blood pouring down golden walls, seeping into the stone of the house it has marked, Hector's house. Pain draws a low groan from my lips. Let me out, I do not fear the pain. The fury's scream echoes up the well inside me. She would bear this walk for me if I let her. She would take my pain and turn it into rage unleashed upon the world. As she did the morning, the false god paid a visit to my chamber, and the fury drove him out, knife in hand, red blood spattered upon white sheets. Even now, the blood sings to her. Let me out, she screams. Let me right all the wrongs done. Let me carry this for you. She would carry it. For me, they all would. The crone, the wraith, the child, the hawk. Every shade that lives within me would gladly spare me now. And they have spared me since I was a sad, broken girl who first stumbled upon the secret well inside her, the place where they live. Where did you come from? I asked on my second visit to the well. We were forged in blood and born of pain, the crone rasped. She lifted her chin, and I knew. My blood, my pain. You are not alone, said the child, taking my hand in hers. Not anymore. We can bring you safety, added the crone. We can be your shade when the light gets too bright, but only if you welcome us. As much as they frightened me, the choice they offered was the only one within my power to make. And so I did. They have been my shield against a world that has forsaken me. They have been my friends when those who were meant to love me left me here to rot. But this walk I must make is one I can trust to no one, not even them. I fix my gaze upon my brother's house as memories swirl through my head. Hector as a young man, sneaking me honeyed nuts from the pocket of his robes. Lifting me onto his shoulders, running, his arms holding mine up to the sun so that it felt like we were flying. Sitting at my side, listening to the stories that made the others run from me. Hector never ran. He always stayed, and it was never a duty that bound him fast, but love. Hector, Troy's hope, Andromache's husband, favorite son and soon-to-be father. Before he was any of these things, he was my brother. A boy who offered secret smiles that felt like treasures. A protector who would have guarded me against every threat, if only he could see it. But he couldn't see the threat that broke me, just as he cannot see this one. But I do, I see it. For Hector, I face down the door again. Another step, another wrench in my guts. It's not the pain that stops me. It isn't even the lock on my door. No, I've walked out of this tower many, many times, but tonight is different. For the first time in 12 years, tonight I must leave this tower as myself. The crone, the child, the fury, the wraith, the hawk. They have all taken their turns to spare me from what lives outside. They have each protected me from the man who walks my father's halls. 12 years, and still the thought of him shatters me. Slivers and fragments of pottery and bone. I can't face him, but I also can't hide here. Not anymore. The raptors have seen to that. The sharpest pain yet racks my stomach. A stream of green bile pours out of my mouth to splatter the stones beneath my feet. Now, it has to be now, the crone commands. Quick, it must be quick, the child whispers in my ear. The wraith merely points. Yes, I know, the path I must take, the task to accomplish and how it should be done. So much knowledge, so much truth, and what good has it ever done me? What values are my visions and my warnings if nobody else can hear them? I grab fistfuls of hair and slam my back against the wall. No man will ever take your word over mine. How true the words the false God spoke to me that morning have proved themselves to be. No man has ever believed me, no man except for one, and if I don't find a way to leave this tower, the raptors will rend the soft flesh of everything he loves, picking my brother clean. I bite back a moan, cross the last few feet of the door, and rap my knuckles against the wood. 3 sharp knocks followed by 2 thuds. The door opens to reveal the dark silhouette behind it. The wraith cries silently at the bottom of my well at the sight of the grizzled man. Like the master of keys, the wraith lived in this tower long before I came here. She belongs to the master just as he belongs to her. And though we've never spoken these words out loud, I think a part of him has always known it. It is why he guards this tower, why he helps me now. He ignored her voice when she still had one, blocked his ears to her words when they might have made a difference, and as a penance for this sin, he now lives in silence. It's through those silences that we have learned to speak. The master of keys watches me with broken eyes. I want to smile, to give him some comfort for the wraith's sake, but it is whispered in the streets that my smile could make Cerberus cower. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. I pause on the stairway with bold palms pressed against the wall. Tap, tap, tap. My knees knock. The world is still, but somehow I am spinning. Pressure on my shoulder, warmth. I look into the face of the master of keys. His arm is a bridge connecting me to solid ground. I stare at it in wonder. His hands, calloused, covered in age spots and white limestone dust from drawing. I raise my eyes to the drawings on the walls. A maze of twisting lines and doors leading to darkness, circles within circles, rings stacked upon rings, each one with its own guardian. Some are clearer than others. Hector before the Scian gate, Priam and Hecuba in the citadel, Laocoon and the council before the temple of lies. On and on they go, but none of them are the ones I am searching for. A weaver trapped with her loom, her outline gently scrubbed out by sorrowful hands until only the barest traces remain. My eyes skate across other lines, thicker than the rest, new. A small shadow scurrying across the plain, a shade wandering Troy's walls, a lone hawk sitting on a tower. Language of shapes and lines the master of keys and I share just as we share the wraith. I find the figure I am searching for and rake a bloody nail across it. The master of keys nods. I hold up my hand and he places something on my palm, an iron key. I reach into the satchel hidden under the folds of my robe. A curved edge of the sharpest bronze flashes in the moonlight. I grip the knife in one hand, the key in the other. I start down the stairs. Halfway to the landing, the pain strikes again, so sharp. I press my shoulder into the cold stone to keep from tumbling face first. Careful, whispers the crone deep in the well. But not too careful, giggles the child, deeper still. The wraith watches and the fury rages, and the hawk banks in the clouds as I pick myself up and descend to the main palace. After all this time, my feet still know the way. They skip down the wide corridors, dodge behind the columns and across the offering tables like the specter some claim me to be. Every moment that passes, the pain inside me grows stronger, the shadows deeper. If I don't hurry, soon it will be too late. Hallway after hallway, corridor after corridor, door after door, until at last I find the one that I need. I take out the key. It slides easily into the lock. The door swings open. I walk into a room flooded with moonlight. In the far corner, a lone figure stands at a loom, weaving many shapes. Shapes I have already seen once tonight, drawn by a broken man's hands. The woman turns. She eyes the open door behind me with longing before she rises. Fear floods the room. I open my mouth, and then I force myself to speak in the voice I rarely use. Mine. Come, Helen, it is time. Okay, well, I think we can open for questions now? Is that about right? Okay. Okay. Great. Oh, we got one already. She's got a. Do you want to wait for the mic or? Okay. Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
So first of all, I always love stories that are told from multiple perspectives of women. There's been a few books like that, and they always end up being favorites of mine. I love that style. I think that's really wonderful, especially with very traditionally male-centric stories like this one. So my question for you as an author is whether you had one of these women that you liked writing about the most, that you sort of resonated with the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of them. There's a piece of each of Danielle and I in all of them, but I definitely think I connected the most with Andromache, and that probably was partly to do with where I was, my stage of life when we first drafted this novel, or the two novels. So we started writing during the pandemic, and I was actually pregnant with my son, and I think like a lot of people who were either giving birth or had very young children during a global pandemic, you're like, what kind of world am I bringing this child into? Like, what is going on? What is happening? How am I going to keep this kid safe? It was I remember just going to doctor's appointments and taking off like everything after, because we didn't know anything at that point, and coming home and being like, I got to take off my clothes outside and like go hose off, because I was just in this medical environment. And so it was just a very crazy space to be in. And then to write this story about a woman in the first book, she's really struggling with the idea of being a mother. She doesn't want to let go of the freedoms that she has had. She has this. Her and Hector have been married for many years, but a child hasn't come, and so she is, of course, looked down on by the city because of that, because she is expected to produce the heir, and so she's really kind of struggling with those different parts of her. And in Daughters of Bronze, when she does give birth to Astyanax, the child that's named in the Iliad, she finds a new part of herself, but also still has the old parts of herself, and so she's trying to integrate those two things. And so I think that being a mother in a world that feels like it's ending, that was kind of the space we were in when we were writing this. Danielle has 4 boys. And so we were both writing this book where we literally had kids bouncing off the walls and trying to figure out, this was our safe place, our escape was like, let's go to the collapse of the Bronze Age as we're trying to endure the global pandemic. So I think for those reasons, Andromache and kind of her struggles with all the different parts of herself, and then her fierce love for her husband and child, and trying to protect the people she loves. I think, that she was probably my favorite character to write. And I also really like writing characters that people call unlikable. That is something because I'm like, why does every female character have to be likable? And so I really liked writing someone who is very flawed and very in your face, and very, not everybody is gonna like her all of the time. And so she felt very real to me because of that. Yes.
I was wondering, like, how you got to the stage of like being a writer. Is your like career like over your life? I know you talked about like kind of like being passionate about these stories when you're young, and I was just interested.
Yeah. So Danielle and I each published individually before we came together and started writing together. And I probably would recommend that to anyone who's wanting to become a writer and is like, oh, you can write with somebody else. It's like, no, write by yourself first, because writing with somebody else is really is amazing. But it is. I'm glad we both had a bit of experience coming into it, but we still learned a ton. So I would say, was always a reader from a very, very, very young age. I'm sure my dad will have some stories to tell. But I was always a reader, and I didn't think that writing was a job. Like I was like, oh, there's all these books in the library. I loved libraries as a child, but I never really thought about the people who wrote them, and that was something people did. So I'm not one of those writers who always wanted to be a writer, because I didn't really think of it as a possibility. I just knew I loved reading. I loved escaping into fictional worlds, whether they were books or films. Um, I was a history major in college, and I think after I graduated, I always loved reading historical fiction as well. And I thought, well, that's something you can do with a history degree, is you can try to write a historical novel, because that takes a lot of research. And so that's kind of how I dipped my toes into writing, is trying to write historical fiction after graduation. And then, like most authors will tell you, it was a very long, 10-year overnight success story after that. But Danielle and I think, and she kind of has her own story, but she always wanted to be a writer, but we both were each other's first readers and critique partners, or beta readers, as sometimes people call them. So we like to say we've been reading each other's notes since the 10th grade, in our extremely bad handwriting, and then we've been reading each other's writing, since we started. So that really helped us with writing books together, as we know each other's voices, we know each other's writing, and we've kind of been in each other's head that way, for over 10 years. So does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? I know most of the other people here I'm related to, so but maybe there's a burning question they've always wanted to ask. Yes.
This is sort of like a half-baked thought, but going off of like you being a history major and stuff, what was your experience like balancing fiction and like fact and trying to find like a balance in retelling and keeping it truthful somewhat?
Yes, that's a great question, and it is such a tricky balance, because there's the historian brain that is like, no, you cannot change anything. But then there's the storyteller who's like, no, sometimes if you want people to read a novel, the story has to come first, because that is why people pick up a novel to read. They'll go read a nonfiction history book if they just want the history. But if they pick up historical fiction, they want a story. So I definitely want to remain truthful to the history. But one of our favorite things as a writing duo is finding the gaps. And I think most historical novelists will say that's the best place to find a story, is to see where the historical record has details, and then there might just be this mention of this one person, and then and they did something really amazing, but we don't really know any of the details around that, or some event that has kind of this very something theoretical that people debate about, but nobody really knows what actually happened. Those are like very fertile places for a novelist to be able to remain faithful to history and not try to just change things entirely, but to be able to give a fresh spin and to be able to put the storytelling first, because you have that room to play. And that even came up with with these books, because we're trying to root it in history, but we're basing it on a myth. So we're basing it on previous fiction, presumably. And so we're looking at, but people are very, very attached to these characters. And so we were hesitant about making drastic changes to the stories in the original myths, because of the attachment people have. But I think we've been pleasantly surprised and relieved at how the changes have been received, because again, we always tried to root them in something that comes from the original material. So if we're making Andromache an Amazon, it's not just because we want to turn her into Katniss. It's because we were like, whoa, the giving Hector counsel, what's that about? There's more here. Let's give her a backstory that explains why that's in the original. Or Helen, she's blamed for the war, but it's pretty, if we take the gods out of the equation, did she really run off with Paris or not? Or was she abducted, which is something that happened in the ancient world when you were, you had a rival, a rival nation. Maybe you wanted to stir up trouble. You go and you steal someone from that country, and that starts a conflict. So we were interested in kind of changing the myth, but actually changing it to try to make it more historically plausible instead of less. And so hopefully most readers seem to be okay with that so far. Any other questions?
Yeah. What was it like reading a book with another woman about more women in a book where gender identity was essential supported community?
Yeah, so what was it like writing a book with another woman about these four women?
In a book where gender identity is essential component.
In a book where gender identity is a central component.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it was amazing. I mean, that's what was so fun about it, is we're writing about sisterhood, and then we're having this experience of making art with somebody, which is honestly probably one of the most vulnerable things you can do with another person. And I don't think we realized that going in, because we've been friends for so long. We finish each other's sentences. We were very close, and yet it was still like, oh my god, goodness, this feels very like a huge trust fall, because I'm not sending you my polished, final draft that I'm sending to my agent. I'm sending you like the material in its rawest form, and you're gonna take, because we're basically layering bricks. So we each originally took two of the characters and wrote the first draft, or kind of gave the two of the characters a voice. But after that, when people ask us, who did you write? We don't like to really say, because it's not as simple as that, because it eventually became this thing where it was like, sometimes I remember I was reading one draft of a character that Danielle had originally created the voice for, and we highlight lines in green when we really like something, as like shorthand for like, this is amazing. And I highlighted something in green, and I think I did leave a comment, and she's like, well, yeah, you wrote it, so. And I had completely forgotten, because that was how the level of collaboration that it ended up being, is there were places where we forgot who actually contributed what, because it was so layer upon layer and so collaborative. But that is, writers, I think, I would be hard pressed to find a writer who's not somewhat of a control freak, because that is that is the realm where you are basically playing God. Like, you are the author, you can control what is happening, and then to bring somebody else into that who has their own ideas and their own things that they're drawn to, and things that they don't like in books, and things that they really love in books that maybe you are not like crazy about. Like, bringing all that together and being able to talk about it, I think that just it's I don't know, it just strengthened our all the themes, our belief in all the themes that were in the book. That this idea that if women kind of break down the walls between them, amazing things can happen. And yeah, it was just a really incredible experience to kind of live some of the things that we felt like we were writing about, like these women coming together for a higher purpose, and trying to kind of build something and achieve a mission together. So yeah, the two things definitely were very, very connected, and kind of fed off of each other. Yeah. Yes.
Was it when you were first coming up with the idea for these four women, was it always these four women? Or were there other possible characters that you were looking at? Or you mentioned Hector is such a pivotal character within the book. Was there ever going to be a point of view from Hector, or was it always just the women?
That's really interesting because I don't think we ever did discuss writing from Hector's point of view, and I wonder why that is. Because, like I said, we didn't set out saying, "Oh, we're going to write a book of Troy from the perspective of women." We're like, we want to write a book from the Trojans' perspective, and then it ended up being women, and it ended up. I think we wanted to definitely write Andromache and Hector as a love story. So I taught high school English for a few years, and I taught at a school where we actually spent the whole first semester reading the Iliad. So the kids would come in every day having read 10 pages the night before, and then we would talk about those 10 pages. So they actually like read it. They didn't read the Spark Notes. Like we really talked about it. And I just remember when we read that famous farewell scene that I have mentioned a few times between Hector and Andromache. I walk into the class the next day, and my students had written on the whiteboard a big heart that said Hector plus Andromache, and I was just like, okay, somebody has to write their story. So, 10th graders are this passionate about it. So I think we always wanted to write that story. And then the idea for Rhea came on pretty quickly after that of having, because it's really convenient to have a character who is kind of in the shadows and who doesn't have as much baggage with the myth. And so she could be kind of our little person who was she's called the little mouse in the narrative. That's kind of her symbol. And she's small for her age. She can move through the shadows unseen, and that ends up being her superpower. The thing that allows her to have such an incredible impact is her ability to do this. And so I think those two characters we always wanted to write, and then Helen and Cassandra kind of developed as we discussed the idea more and more. And they were eventually just going to be little kind of snippets from them here and there, and they ended up being much bigger parts of the story. And then all four parts kind of ended up converging together. We thought they would be a little bit more like, this character is doing her thing, and this one's over here doing something else. And what was really amazing about the process of working with somebody is, as we were kind of discussing all of this, it ended up being like, no, they have one story, and they're all moving for one common goal. And hopefully that's what makes it a powerful story, is because we have these four perspectives, but they all come together and unite. Great. Yes.
So, I just love this topic. When I was in high school, I remember reading the Odyssey and being really fascinated with people like Penelope
Yeah.
that are just sort of hanging out in the background, and you're like, they went through so much, but where is their experience? And there are a couple of authors. I think Margaret Atwood wrote one from Penelope's perspective, and I would love more of that sort of stuff. Have you, or you and your co-author, thought about doing more stories like this, like more mythological, like the Odyssey and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I love Penelope too. I've always been fascinated by her story. Another, I believe, I haven't read them myself, but I've heard Claire North has a trilogy of mythology retellings that I think feature Penelope pretty heavily. So she would be a good author to look into. I think we definitely want to continue in the space of telling historical stories, or myth kind of meets history, that feature the perspective of women, and that's definitely something we want to continue. Our dream would be to write the Aeneid. Are you familiar with the Aeneid? So after the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid follows the small band of Trojans who survived the collapse of Troy, and they sail off to Italy to have and they end up founding a new city, which ends up being Rome. And so it's kind of like my students used to call it like fan fiction of the Odyssey and the Iliad, because it's like both stories in one. But it would be very fun to write some of the characters we've come to love in these books, the ones who do make it out, and then to have them go on this whole new epic adventure around the Mediterranean until they end up in Italy. So that would be a story we would, in this vein, we would definitely like to tell, but I think we'll probably end up writing, and we're not necessarily going to just stick to the ancient world, but I think we do want to continue writing these kinds of stories, multiple POVs, the perspective of women, and kind of untold stories where there's those gaps in history that are kind of just waiting to be filled in. Yeah, great question, thank you. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming. Yes, go for it.
Where can I find copies of your books? And do you have audiobooks of your books?
Yes, and the audiobook is awesome. I mean, it's the narrators. So they chose 4 different, and I will call they're actresses because they bring these characters to life. So the audiobook is amazing. I definitely recommend that. The 4 narrators really captured all 4 characters. And then I know the library here has copies of the books, and then the local bookstores in town, Horizon Books, and pretty much any bookstore that you want to shop at. So thank you. Yes.
So, 2 questions. First one is, do you have a favorite mythology book other than Homer's Iliad?
Favorite mythology? It probably would be the Aeneid. Yeah. And that is probably because I taught both of those books like very in depth. So I think I have a special relationship with them, like reading them on my own and then kind of seeing the stories come alive through the eyes of my students. So those 2, yeah.
And then, what are you currently reading?
Wow. This might be a surprise, but I am like very much into horror at the moment. And so I am listening to a lot of horror audiobooks, which, yeah, I don't know where that's going to lead, but historical horror is, I just saw, what did we just see in the theater? Oh, Nosferatu, yes. And so that has put me in a historical fiction meets horror space. So we'll see if anything comes of that. But yeah, it was very good. Yeah, it was very good. Yes, thank you all for coming out.